All right, we are back again today.
We are set to discuss more on intergenerational trauma with a focus today on religious and spiritual trauma. One thing that we just want to maybe specify getting started when we talk about religious trauma, those would be more of the formal institutions related with one's religion, not something where maybe if uh, maybe someone lost a loved one and then it was like, why could God allow this to happen? That would be something we would be defining today as more of like a spiritual trauma or something like that. So I just want to maybe define those two things of religious would be the formal institutions and spiritual being more of the personal experience. I know sometimes those words are used like interchangeably. So just want to make sure today that we are talking a little bit um, in some specifics about what is going on.
Yes, thank you for that clarification because I feel pretty guilty sometimes of getting them confused or interchanging them unintentionally.
Yeah, I mean, it can be really simple to switch up. And so our goal of the podcast is just to keep breaking things down, making it easier to manage things. For today, I thought it would be helpful to kind of think about like why does generational trauma maybe matter when we're talking about religious trauma? So, in for specific families, if you've grown up within a specific faith group or movement, things that have gone on in that movement are going to be felt like across generations, whether that's like having to relocate or like who you're allowed to air quotes allowed to marry or like with the setup or arrangements of things. So, I mean, there's a lot of things that can be impacted simply by what the rules of like maybe the organization or guiding principles are.
Yeah. I think too of recognizing that as we're talking about like intergenerational religious and spiritual trauma, we're putting a really big emphasis on like those beliefs that have been passed down through family, those cultural norms, those practices that are, typically reinforced by those religious teachings, those community expectations within that religious structure.
Yeah. So just kind of getting into a few things. So religious beliefs aren't always negative. So I want to make sure we have that as we're just talking. So there are lots of links for different religious groups and their religiosity being a protective factor. So one of the things we know in therapy from our training is that if someone does have spiritual or religious beliefs, that's a protective factor. If they're connected to a religious community, there is a protective factor there for something like suicide, homicide, managing low moments of mental health. But we're going to get a little bit into some of the challenges that come with religious beliefs and where some of those can be um, coming from and challenging. Some of the things where we're going to talk a little bit more about positive is like having a worldview that is positive by having a religious view of the world, having a sense of purpose with difficult situations, a sense of meaning. There is a discouragement about maladaptive coping. There's extra social support. There's a promotion of connecting with other people and lack of a need for personal control, a focus on forgiveness, thankfulness, and a sense of hope for the future. So that would be when we're talking about positive connections that can come from being connected to a religious group. That is what we are bringing up. Tiffany, anything else you would list as a positive for religious connections that you found maybe in your research or prep for this episode?
I think it's a lot of it aligned with what you were saying. It can be extremely helpful for some individuals to have that religious foundation and have that as a lens that they utilize to function throughout the world.
Yeah. So we'll get a little bit more into challenges. So I think I want to kind of maybe define what it could look like to have a challenge of religious trauma. So we need to define this first, and then we'll get a little more specific today with the intergenerational trauma piece. Religious trauma occurs when a religious official or religious community uses a person's spiritual beliefs against them. to impact a person's actions, decision making, and well being. So, some of the causes of religious trauma can include using guilt and shame to control behavior. This often occurs in organizations with strict moral codes and rules. So, you know, there are some situations and stories documented where someone like was a single mother that got pregnant and felt shame to give their child up. And then, someone finds out years later that they're adopted and maybe why. Like that is the textbook definition of a religious trauma experience and one that can be connected across generation. The other one I want to maybe just hit first is strict gender roles. So when there's a justification for discrimination, shaming, or power imbalances, that is something that can be used against uh, both genders. But if we're speaking maybe for the United States, typically it would be the patriarchy and women being in less power roles or having less power or equity in the relationship. Anything so far you would add, Tiffany, to any of this?
I think as you were talking, it kind of really aligned with like the signs of generational trauma that I had kind of made note on. So like on a personal level, sometimes individuals experience that fear of questioning any religious teachings whatsoever. Some of that worthlessness, shame, inherent full sinfulness that can come from questioning a religious struggles with religious deconstruction or faith shifts, anxiety over morality, death, or divine punishment. On a family level, it can look like pressure to conform to religious expectation, emotional manipulation. An example, if you leave the faith, you're going to break my heart. Some conditional love based on religious adherence. And in a cultural slash societal level, it can look like marginalization or ostracation of those who leave or question the faith, systemic control of gender roles, sexual orientation, or identities, and religious institutions sometimes can shape legal and social policies.
Yeah, I think that's largely what we're going through right now in the United States is a religious movement that is also showing up as a political movement with Project 2025 and uh, lots of the things that have been attempted. So yeah, those are really all those things are like really relevant, but I want to just maybe like kind of review some of the info today because like I don't want to go over any of it too quick. When we're talking about like shame and guilt being used to control, that is part of the system of like, oh well, if you leave, like you don't come to church with us, you don't go. If you go out and live with your girlfriend, boyfriend, in the same place, whatever, like you won't be allowed around us, you won't have the support. So there's like a lot of things at stake. And if we're getting even more within to like the queer community, there are lots of conversations that um, are happening or being avoided just from the simple stake of like someone being who they are and like the implications. So not every person is in a situation to be able to be their full authentic selves and be true and keep family ties. And so I want to make sure that today we aren't trying to tell anyone what they should do. We're just wanting to highlight uh, the challenges that people are facing and experiencing because these are all very personal decisions. And something like I say a lot in therapy is like, it's not up to me to decide what you're going to do because you are the one that is going to have to live with the impact of the decisions that are made. So if you are listening today and you have experienced some spiritual or religious trauma, just please trust your own inner wisdom and maybe check in with trusted people who are safe, just because we don't want to be trying to give any blanket suggestions because everyone's situation is different, especially when we're getting into um, religion and family and spirituality. So something you kind of touched on, Tiffany, is there can be a fear-based teaching, like that external groups or threats, or there's punishment, or maybe spiritual damnation or impending apocalypse. So, I mean, in a lot of faith traditions, there's this idea of like if you change beliefs or go against the beliefs that you are irredeemably damned and going to be unable to move on to the next life, or in some cases, like have a blessed life on earth. So there's a lot of things that can be done. So, I mean, even if someone has grown up in that and is no longer practicing, if you've spent 20 years hearing a lot of these things, believing a lot of these things, that can have an impact um, moving forward. So, anything, Tiffany, for you, you just want to add?
Yeah, I was gonna say one of the earliest kind of like fear moments that come into place relative to what you're talking about was like that missionary work and that forced religious conversion during European colonization, where we impose that Christianity on indigenous peoples, kind of giving them no option of they either join and erase and revoke their own spiritual practices to join that cultural tradition. And that conversion
Ooh,
was often achieved through coercion, violence, social pressures. I know there was a lot of boarding schools for indigenous children to help kind of quote unquote erase those spiritual practices that were native to those generations. And even now,
oh man.
generation later, descendants are still struggling with reconciling with their ancestors who were forced
Yeah.
through that
I mean, it's a
conversion.
robbed generation of trying to wipe out a language, beliefs, a culture. It's yeah, it's so regrettable. And honestly, you could look in like anywhere around the world and see this. I mean, religion has shaped so much of human history. So obviously that's a little challenging. One of the things I think it highlights on this really well, Tiffany, is like excommunication and shunning. So if like you're disobedient, you'll be shunned. So for example, uh, I guess I mean it's just we live local. There's Amish communities in like Southwest Ohio and kind of in
Mhm.
Indiana, but this is a thing. So you get Rumspringa. So I think it's when you turn 17 or 16, you get the chance to go out in the world for a period of time and have a smartphone, have a car, try things out, and then if you decide to leave, you can. But what happens is you're shunned. So like it's this very interesting thing where you get a chance to try stuff out, and if you stay, it's like okay, you're staying forever. But people do leave this community, but if they do, they will be shunned. So I know there's some like social media influencers who have talked about this, but I mean that's wild because I mean I just think as I sit here right now, if someone told me, "Hey, if you leave, you will never talk to any of your family again, anyone in your family, anyone in your community you've grown up with, anyone you know, like none of them are going to talk to you." Um, so like that's a very powerful motivator to remain in a community. And that's why I just want to make sure like we're talking about these are very complicated decisions for people to make because that's a very it's not just, oh, I don't believe this and I'm going to change something. It's like, oh, I'm going to lose everyone and everything I know.
Yeah,
And
what's
that's yeah.
as I say, kind of like very similar to like the Islam and the honor culture that I was researching, finding that individuals who question or leave Islam may experience severe rejection, shame, even violence due to being like dishonoring the family. I can only imagine like the sheer emotional overwhelm and like terrified like thoughts and feelings that come up about like questioning a faith and recognizing like this faith isn't just a faith, it like connects me to like all of my family and support system, or like it could like there could be physical repercussions for me doing this as well.
Yeah. I mean it is very dangerous. Yeah, there's so much danger I think involved. Sometimes there can be a challenge. And I just want to say, I know some really wonderful religious individuals who are some of the best thinkers I know. But in some circles, and that's what we're talking about, in some circles, there is a repression of critical thinking. So challenging like critical discussions or critiques of a topic or nuances. And I mean, I'm not meaning to close on this lightly, but like just to make sure we can talk about this, the physical, emotional, sexual, or financial abuse can also be something that can occur when it is like occurring from religious leaders or those in positions of authority. Um, and I think a lot of us are familiar with some of the Catholic Church situations. And so some of the challenges that happened of like rescheduling and moving priests who are accused of abuse around, and almost the idea of protecting the institution over survivors and victims. But
Yeah.
it's very sad. I know Tiffany and some of the work we've done, like we know that that's not an isolated event, that these are events that happen and power can be corrupting. Um,
Yeah. There's a very
so,
popular event from that happened with the Latter-day Saints in Texas. Um, I don't remember if you had heard anything about this on the news or in your research, but where like there was this one witness who managed to get out. There's a really good book called The Witness Wears Red. Um,
ooh,
and it's her story about like how she grew up in the Latter-day Saints, how like this was her faith, and like how that faith like to this day she still follows in some capacity, but it's evolved over like
wow.
getting out of like those abusive tendencies that like they went to the extremes with.
Wow. No, I haven't watched. I'm fascinated by it. Formal institutions and some of the experiences because I think the thing like, and I want to make sure like I wish this wasn't such a thing, like that this wasn't so well known, but it is really interesting. Like no matter what culture you go to, there is the beauty of religion and there is the pain. And so some of the things that, we probably don't even have enough time to scratch the surface. But like if you're a member of a religious organization, just acknowledging some of these things that have happened in the past or some of the challenges that have happened. And it can be uncomfortable. And frankly, it probably should be uncomfortable. Like if I know the church I go to used to say really problematic things, like that's uncomfortable to sit with. But those are some of the things when we're talking a little bit about if you're within a community, how can you bring about change? But probably not a full discussion for today. But this is an uncomfortable conversation. This is not a great thing. And I do think a lot of things have taken steps forward, but I don't think we can ever be doing too much to address generational trauma or to prevent when we're talking about things like physical, emotional, sexual, or financial abuse. Like all of those things, I think people would agree are negative and bad, and not something that people want to see their higher power or belief system used to perpetrate trauma on anyone. So I would say probably 99% of people would be in agreement on the things we're saying right now of like those things are bad, and we don't want them to occur. Um, some of the things that I kind of want to pull into this conversation is like what, and so I've grown up Christian, practicing Christian. That means different things to different people. One of the challenges I have had with that experience is that not all of my views line up with the demographics. So sometimes I've had some challenges of like, these are some beliefs. So I'm sharing that openly here just because I want to say I am more comfortable critiquing Christianity because I'm an active member in that community, and have grown up in that system than I would speaking on another faith system or belief. So that's just where I'm going to sit in today. But I don't mean to say I'm the authority on Christianity, but I just will say, like, I feel comfortable critiquing something I'm a part of versus if I was not, I would not maybe be as strongly worded on some things. Um, but when we're talking about like spiritual abuse, like I want to just kind of give some examples of what that could look like, because that also is religious trauma, feeling forced into certain religious beliefs, being gaslit or manipulated a person's belief for a sense of purpose to control. So a really good example if we're talking about financial abuse is, oh, the pastor needs a new house. We really need to come together. That's what the Lord is calling us to do for this pastor's house. Like, and sometimes you'll see stories go viral about like, mega church pastors who have really nice cars or um, like mansions or something, and like that idea kind of undercutting some of the beliefs. But also just like, maybe manipulating them into serving. Like, oh, what would really help the pastor is like going and doing errands, or what would help the church doing. And so there's a whole thing of like unpaid labor volunteering within some churches, and it's very controlling. And so churches are nonprofits, and so there is some risk of exploitation of exploiting unpaid labor to raise money or do different things. So I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole, Tiffany, but I find this very interesting.
Yeah. I was curious, you brought up like the volunteering. Um I don't practice in any religious capacity anymore. But I have heard
Yeah.
of some really good programs by different cultures and different religions that have actually like been for pretty amazing causes, like building houses and
Yeah.
pantries and things to people in need.
Yeah, no, there's like really powerful things. It's so interesting. So I'm gonna call myself out first before I say anything else. I've gone on lots of short-term missions in my life, like other countries, the whole thing, like the critique. And so there has been a really, I think, beautiful movement within Christianity of like the ethics around short-term missions and like, hey, is that really missions work? Paying for us to travel, like me go to I've been to Uganda, right? So I've gone to Uganda and I'm helping with the school. Is that the most effective use of community development, or would me just sending money to help a different group where it's local and they can decide on the needs? And so it's just a very nuanced conversation. So I want to call myself out first that I've been a part of that. So I do think there's really cool things. I have noticed a shift to local missions, like local homeless shelters or outreach, or like what's going on in the local community, and then maybe partnering with organizations there, and that would be a more helpful experience and more holistic. There's some very problematic, like the savior complex is a thing. So one of them, her name is Renee Bach. She went to Uganda and she was not trained as a medical professional. I think she took like a 1 day course and was acting as a doctor on an orphanage and taking children, and they were not getting competent medical care. And there was dozens on dozens of children who died under her care from neglect. And so she's current. I think the case is still ongoing, but she's not in Uganda anymore. But the place was shut down. So I think people can have beautiful intentions, but as you and I know, Tiffany, intentions doesn't mean impact. So, um, but I bring up this example is that sometimes though people can feel guilty about not wanting to go. So if we just use that example, like maybe, this isn't my church, but like, if there was a short-term mission trip, it's like, oh, well, if you were a real Christian, you would believe this is okay and support it or give money to this. And that's an example that I think unfortunately has happened to a lot of people where they felt guilty to give money or change something, go on something. So if people want to do those things, I'm not trying to sit here as the authority. I think that's great, but it's just acknowledging some people have felt pressured, like a timeshare presentation of, oh, I need to be willing to go on this trip, or oh, I need to be willing to do this. So yeah, I don't want to go. I'm going to use my weight, Tiffany, that I don't go too off the rails. But I find this very interesting. One, because I've grown up in these environments, but two, like when you can see how if someone is like, oh, it's not just my beliefs, it's God's beliefs, that like that, and they have an authority saying that, like there's real risk of exploitation, very easily, like a power differential, authority differential, even in like your belief system, like that gets very problematic.
Mhm. Yeah, it sounds like it can be pretty sticky also to determine like when a mission is ethically beneficial versus like something that is just being used as like I hate to be blunt, but a feel good experience.
Yeah, no, it's for the participant, not the community. And I will say, like, the trips I've went on, like, changed my worldview, opened my eyes to so much that was very helpful. And I can also acknowledge there were probably other ways I could have done that without those experiences. And there's some really beautiful stories of like what it felt um, like I don't wanna mess up the interviews, but just, like, how it feels from a local perspective that, like, if people were coming from across the world to save us, like, I wanna appreciate that experience if someone was coming into my neighborhood and was like, "You guys don't know what you're doing, you're not taking enough care. Here, let us show you, let us save you," like, and then leave and never come back, like, it's very problematic, you know? One of the things that I think we also should talk about is using scripture or religious doctrine to protect otherwise abusive individuals. I think this is a very common experience, regardless of faith tradition of like someone's in the wrong, being coercive, being abusive, but then having the scriptures utilized against you to say, well, they're called the truth. They're called to be a truth speaker. They're called to shepherd the flock. Like that can be very challenging because to say there's not different ways of enacting things or addressing things. Um, so again, like, and also one that as I think this is moving in the right direction, but I can say that this is not made its way to all situations yet. But there's times where you'll hear stories of people in domestic violence situations, and they'll go to their religious leaders, and the religious leaders are like, "Oh, stay with them, pray with them. Let's give you some spiritual counseling." And, again, these are personal decisions, but like, there have been a lot of survivors of domestic violence who have felt their religious beliefs were used against them to remain in unsafe situations or relationships. So that's a challenge I have for faith leaders or people within faith communities is like, let's support survivors better. Let's support statistically, let's support women better. It's not always women, but we need to be more supportive of those going through situations like that and have uncomfortable conversations. I view religion as a thing to call us to be the best version of ourselves, not a scapegoat for me to do bad things or things I shouldn't be doing, but fall back on, oh, I have this I'm the head of house or something, which I don't believe, but just, that you can see how people can use that to their advantage, especially if they're an abusive person.
Yeah, and that kind of plays into what I was reading, and I found I'm not the expert on this, but just some of the data that I found that like Hinduism is deeply tied to a caste system, which is used to determine social status, occupation, and used to justify oppression in those communities. Um, So, like,
Yeah.
for example, women in typical traditional Hindu households face pressure to uphold specific religious rituals, maintain purity, and conform to very strict marital expectations, which is just part of like that religious teaching. So, it aligns with what you're saying of like sometimes we can take scripture a little too far and use it as justification to, you know, justify suffering, enforce strict gender roles, enforce like social inequality, things of that nature.
Yeah. So one of the I just yeah, it's a conversation I could go in a lot of I don't want to overwhelm anyone today with stuff, but I think these conversations matter. I want to say a beautiful trend I'm noticing is like so many therapists, we are becoming more competent working with spiritual and religious trauma. I even know people that's their full niche, like that's what they're working on. And I think like that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. I will say that like I work a lot as a substance use counselor with clients in early recovery, long-term recovery. And some of that work often looks like me processing some of the wounds they've had from maybe how they were treated by people within the religious community. But I think there's more and more competence moving around. But I just want to make sure, and my last new piece to bring up is like, how does religious trauma affect child development? And I just want to mention like a few things like delayed social skills, harmed emotional awareness, compromised sexual education, damaged self-worth. This is probably the spiciest take I'm going to give, but we really need better sex education in the United States. When we do not have like health literacy or sexual literacy, like that makes people more vulnerable to abuse. And I don't mean to say that someone that is less literate is like deserving of anything. That is not what I mean to say. But like when we are not educating and informing, like we are keeping people vulnerable. And like we know there are abusers, we know there are bad actors wanting to hurt people. So we really need to keep people safe. Um, and I do think a lot of religious communities, we need to work harder to screen for abuse, background checks, keeping children safe. And, it's okay to have uncomfortable conversations. Nope, you're not going to work with the kids. Um, and keeping children safe. So that was just the last piece, Tiffany. I wanted to say of like how could this show up? We're talking about from a generational impact. It can show up kind of innocuously, but still be very problematic.
Yeah, it can show up in a lot of different ways for sure. I mean, it can show up as long-term effect in the nervous system with like religious-based anxiety. Someone might be stuck in fight or flight response. Parent-child relationships can be unhealthy. Sometimes there's an intersection between that religious trauma, complex PTSD, and PTSD. There's some deeply ingrained beliefs that can impact mental health. The grief processing, depending on the faith or the religious following, can be traumatic. Maybe not aligning with your own personal values of how to, how you wish to grieve a loss during that time. But I guess to go off what you were saying, like it is unfathomable that like religiouses across the board would not want individuals educated on their body so that they could understand what's happening so they can make better educated choices regarding like their sexual health, like their sexual knowledge, and an understanding of like the sexual things that come up within different spiritual and religious realms.
Mm.
But that might be another spicy topic for another day.
I there's so much that could be brought up or discussed, but I think it's like helpful to um explore. But I think this was a great like opening discussion. We just really want to keep the dialogue open. So if there's anyone listening that um has any concerns, like I think it can be helpful to discuss. But yeah, I think that's all I have today. But I don't know, Tiffany, if there's anything else you wanted to add?
Just a couple final thoughts. Religious trauma is universal, yet uniquely shaped by cultural history, family expectations, and systemic oppression. Um, Healing requires acknowledging the past, reclaiming autonomy, and finding a path forward that aligns with your personal truth. And finally, potential controversial final thought is no one should feel trapped in a faith or belief system out of fear, guilt, or obligation. Spirituality should be a choice, not a burden on your life.
That's beautiful.
All right, and until next time, guys, take care of yourselves, and we hope to hear some more lovely comments from you guys.
Bye, everybody.